Welcome to the Ericzone podcast. Today I have Tarek Chatila with me in studio. He's a public speaker and a political specialist, originally from Lebanon. Tarek has studied at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Before I start the podcast, I just want to thank people for liking, for sharing the podcasts. The podcast starts at baladoquebec.ca. Please go have a look at baladoquebec.ca for all the great Quebec-made podcasts. After that, it goes on to iTunes. For those of you that are listening to iTunes, please go have a look at the YouTube. This podcast is also a video. Afterwards, it goes on to Facebook, so please like the Facebook page, like and share. Content creators, they need your vote of confidence. They need your likes and your shares, so thank you very much. Also, I should mention that this podcast is part of a series about Lebanon. Go have a look at other podcasts, Ericzone podcasts related to Lebanon. One of them is with Danya Fawaz, who does humanitarian work. There's also a podcast with Reina Halab, who's a public speaker and ambassador for healthy living. So let us proceed. Welcome to the podcast. Could you briefly tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So one of the things I'm involved with is Amnesty International Canada. I'm part of a co-group on Israel-Palestine. In that capacity, I'll do some research. I've written a few things, some blogs and different things. I also speak. For example, I spoke at the World Social Forum a few years ago about the situation in Egypt at that time, specifically the prison situation. So I do a variety of things in that capacity. In the past, I was involved with the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. I worked on a social media kind of reporting series where we were looking at a lot of that was going on during the Syrian Civil War, so Arabic language, social media posting, analyzing them and contextualizing them within the conflict that was going on at that time. So those are some of the things that I do.
So for people listening, you can have a look. I guess people can find you on YouTube. If they write in your name, they'll find a few videos about the lectures that you've given.
Yeah, and you can go on Amnesty International Canada website to see some of the blogs that I've written on Israel-Palestine also.
Politics. Had you always been interested in politics? How did that happen?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, it's kind of a stereotype that a lot of Lebanese people are very much politically inclined. And, I mean, Lebanese people tend to go into things, like business and stuff. They're very business savvy, so they tend to pursue careers in those sectors. But they also are very politically knowledgeable. And I think it's just because if you actually grew up in Lebanon, particularly during, the Civil War, which was from 1975 to 1990, it was just everything is so politicized. It's such an important part of your life. It's such a, it's just everywhere. You're listening to the news, and it's just a violent environment, and you kind of cling to this information. And so it becomes kind of just embedded in you in a kind of a permanent way. So you grow up kind of very aware of everything in a political kind of sense. And so that's probably how it was for me. My father was kind of, involved a little bit. So, it was always part of our environment. So when I got older, eventually I said, okay, well, if I'm going to do something that I'm actually interested in, obviously politics is one of those things. So that's why I pursued it originally.
So you're was your first destination leaving Lebanon, was this Montreal, or did you have a stop somewhere else before?
Well, it's a good question. No, it was not my first destination. So we fled for the final time, in 1984, kind of in the middle of the Civil War, I guess. And we went to Michigan. So we went to Detroit for a few years. And then we decided to move to Montreal. My parents, I was a child. It wasn't like I had a hand in the decision, and so I've been here ever since then. I've been here for 30-something years, yeah.
We're playing it safe. We have the COVID attire here for sure. I've disinfected the microphones and washed everything. So because we can still see it, but I guess it is a sign of respect. The mask in the corner there, we could still see it, but it doesn't matter. we're proud to be playing it safe and acting accordingly. I don't know if we want to get into the COVID thing. I find it interesting that people are it's great to see that people show solidarity and are safe. It's a good. I think it's necessary.
Right. I mean, I think that it's all we hear about on the news, you know, so I think we're all kind of over it. But at the same time, you know, you have to wear it out of respect for the other person, I think.
True.
Especially since it hasn't really been wiped out. So if we're going to actually get to like a point where it's completely gone, these are the types of measures we have to all take, you know. And if you look at how bad it is in the U.S. when people are not following the different suggested distances and whatever, they're not taking those measures, the numbers are getting far worse.
Yeah. They didn't have the infrastructure there to keep it safe, to do exactly what the president of the States wanted, because I guess everybody's all bunched up and stuck in towers and apartment buildings, and everybody's crowded. I can't imagine New York, how that must be. What's going on with COVID in Lebanon is it stopped the current intellectual revolution for sure. People aren't allowed to be in the street as much, and
well, there's a few things happening. So originally when COVID began to kind of reach that part of the world, I'd say that I wouldn't give credit to the leadership, the political leadership necessarily. I just think that the Lebanese people, for a number of reasons, probably managed to kind of keep it very, very low. So there were a few infection area breakouts or whatever. But in a general sense, they've done really well. There haven't been that many people who've been infected. However, in July, on the 1st of July, because you have to understand there's so many economic problems. There's like a perfect storm of economic problems in Lebanon. And so I feel that they were pressured, in a sense, because of all the economic problems, to open things up. So in July, on the 1st of July, they opened up the airport. They allowed businesses to operate again, I guess with maybe some lesser restrictions. And as a result of that, you have now a new outbreak. So the numbers have gotten much worse since July because a lot of people came back. So a lot of people who had been away who weren't able to come back because of COVID, they came back and they did not, again, they didn't follow what they were supposed to do. So they went out, they socialized, they went out in groups, they met people, and the infection rate has now skyrocketed. So it's gotten bad in Lebanon. As far as COVID is considered, as far as the economic thing, as far as the protests is concerned, well, there have been protests going on sporadically for a few years, and it's just that people are like coming out because they're saying, COVID is bad, but things are so bad for me that we have to come out and do something about it. So I think that the protests are gonna continue. How effective are they in actually making the government take actions to change their policies? I don't know. I think it's very, very difficult to see how they're going to come out of this crisis.
The politicians it's similar to other countries. It's similar to, well, again, the States as an example. It's this elite of people that are at the helm that refuse to let go of the power. Currently, you have a multi-millionaire that's in power and just wants to keep making profits, and he's obviously not at the level that someone would need to be in order to govern a country. And I think that's perhaps the same situation. It's fascinating when you can compare those two situations. It's quite similar, I believe.
Well, you have the globalization. Well, as a result of globalization, you have a lot of kind of these global elites who kind of just end up, they're businessmen usually, billionaire businessmen, whether it's in the Middle East or in parts of Europe, or whether it's in the U.S. You have this kind of, in the past, maybe, 20, 30 years, you're seeing a lot of these businessmen that are beginning to lead government. In the U.S., obviously, Trump is completely underqualified for his position. and completely corrupt. I mean, the corruption that you're seeing the Trump administration is beyond anything that we've ever seen before. It is blatant corruption in many ways. And this is how he's always operated. So for him as a businessman, if you actually go back and listen to his interviews or do a bit of a research on him, he's always kind of been this corrupt person. This is how he's done his business. This is how he's operated. So for him, he's doing the same thing he's always done, but as a politician.
Yeah, there is a Netflix show that I watch which just explains the whole process of Trump from A to Z, from his beginning to where he is right now. And there's so many examples out there.
Yeah, he's a scammer. He's basically a
Exactly.
scammer. So for him, it's kind of like not too surprising that he behaves the way he does. If you look at how it is in Lebanon, it's a little bit different. What happened in Lebanon is we have a consociational democracy, which is kind of a power-sharing system where the Lebanese version of it is called confessionalism. So you have different religious groups, different confessions, who are allotted or apportioned different political positions of power. So, I'm sure you know by now, the president has to be a Maronite Christian. The prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim. The speaker of the house has to be a Shia Muslim. And then you divide the parliament seats based also on this calculation. And there are many other groups also who get their share of parliament seats. Now, there hasn't been a census in Lebanon since 1932. But you continue with basically the same format. But we don't know what the actual makeup of the population really is anymore because the government will not do a census because it views this as too politically dangerous. Because you end up with results which may upset one group or another. But the purpose of this kind of a system, confessionalism, is stability. It's supposed to be something where you're getting different people with different backgrounds, different interests who are occupying the same space to politically be able to function so the country isn't in a perpetual state of chaos and conflict. But it's not. It shouldn't be a permanent system. It should be something that eventually you're kind of maybe phase out of. But that is something which is almost impossible in Lebanon. I think in large part it's because to use the system itself to reform itself isn't working. At least there.
Because you don't want to relinquish power if you're at the helm.
They have a good thing going.
Yeah, exactly.
So these guys who are in power, it's dynastic rule. So whoever the leader of the Sunnis is, his father was, this guy's leader, his father was, his grandfather was. You see the same names.
That's fascinating.
With different first names, and they represent their communities. And the communities would be like, yeah, we're going to vote for him because he's our guy and he's, But you're stuck in this system where it's just dynastic, and these newer generations continue to inherit the system, and they've fixed it in a way where it's really very, very beneficial for them. So they're reaping lots of profits, and everything is so deeply, deeply corrupted that there is nothing left anymore. There's nothing left at the core anymore. These guys have been corrupting and benefiting from the system for so long that now it's kind of like this perfect storm. You have so many different things that are causing economic instability. And the solutions are not interesting to the people who are in power because the solutions require them to give up some power.
Exactly.
And it'll cost them money. So that's why, what we're having right now is we're having negotiations with the IMF, right? And we've had negotiations repeatedly with different. We always have these donor conferences. So France being the a colonialist power that was always
associated with the Maronites.
Yes, and associated with Lebanon as such. They're kind of like a traditional ally of Lebanon. So they kind of go out and help bring all these countries together to try to kind of get some money for Lebanon so it doesn't fall apart. And that's how it's been for a while. So you have these donor conferences. I think they're called the Paris conferences, and there have been 3 of them, I think, since 2002. And Lebanon is asked to make particular reforms. So they're given a list. They negotiate. They're given a list. They're saying, here's 100 reforms we want you to do. Lebanon says, okay. They're given some money, and then they stop the reforms, and the money stops. So they never follow through. They're always reneging on their reform promises.
Because they want the holy trinity of power to stay stable, so there's no unbalancing of the the Maronites, the Shia, and the Sunni
Well, I think
stronghold of those three, the confessionalism.
they're all united. All these different groups are united in their corruption. They all have a good thing going in a system. And the dangerous thing about them is, and we're starting to see signs of it now, because we can get into a little bit later what's actually going on in society and how bad it is. But what is starting to happen is you're seeing kind of hints being dropped by the different parties, by the different political people, politicians. And the hints are kind of like, well, suggestive that they're kind of slightly bringing out the specter of a return to civil war. Because there's so much tension that is building up, right? So there's people committing suicide at a higher rate than ever because they have nothing left. The Lebanese lira, which is pegged to the dollar and has historically always been pegged to the U.S. dollar at about 1,500 per U.S. dollar, it is now at 8,000 or 9,000. So imagine if you pay $2 for bread and all of a sudden now bread's going to cost you $12, right? Where are these people going to get the money? Grocery stores cannot afford to buy produce because they're like, how am I going to buy this stuff before I sell it? I don't have that much money. So they can't even get the produce. So shelves are going empty. Stores are closing. So people can't eat. They're trading their possessions on the internet for milk, for bread. And I saw on Twitter this thing where you had a lot of people posting pictures of their empty fridges. Now, you got to understand, these are Lebanese people. These are very proud people, okay? The idea that somebody would declare, telegraph their poverty in this way for everybody to see, ordinarily, that's a very shameful thing. You know what I mean? Lebanese people would never say that. What are you saying? I can't provide for my family, But yet that's what they're doing because the desperation is so bad, and it's everybody, all their friends are the same way. The middle class has been eradicated. So that's how bad it's gotten. So the solutions are that the Lebanon is going to have to negotiate with the IMF and give things up, but they are not willing to give things up. They're trying to do the same thing they've always done, which is agree to a bunch of things and then get the money and never follow through, and they're not having it. The IMF is not having it. There was the French...
because they did send money prior, and it just the money was not used properly.
Yeah,
if I am correct.
Absolutely, it's in large part it's going to be it goes directly in their pockets or wasted or I don't know what. But the types of changes that they're asking for them are one of the most important changes they're demanding is an audit of the bank. So they want to know, what have you been doing? Show us the numbers. And they don't want to do that because if they do that, they're going to see everything's going to be out in the open. Everybody's going to know where the money has gone. And the creative accounting that the bank has been doing to get the numbers to look the way they do. I read in, I think, the Washington Post that as many as $60 billion may be missing. I didn't find a source for it anywhere else, but, ComM, it's the Washington Post, right? And so it's really a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe.
So from my understanding is there was a lot of promises made in regards to capitalism and in regards to there's a lot of import. And from what I understand, the import was kind of used as a promise that there would be a good economy and people can import goods and the economy would thrive that way. But now it's at a point where it just doesn't work anymore. I think there's not a divestment, but the usual investors like France or Arabia or Iran are all like the difficult situation currently economically it doesn't allow for more investment. So all the usual people that invest in Lebanon are not there currently. So that must be very stressful as well on the economy.
Right. So let's break down the major causes of why the economy is so bad. In a general sense, you have to understand this is a situation kind of about the chickens coming home to roost, where you have just decades and decades of endemic corruption. And eventually you have to pay for all the things that you're doing. All the little games that you play to kind of, kick the can down the line a little bit so you can continue to operate, those are all no longer useful. But what has happened, there's many different things that have happened. First of all, you have Lebanon is somebody reliant on imports to a large degree. For everything. And our economy is based primarily on things like, the services sector. So that could be the sale of things like in shops, like maybe diamonds or jewelry, but also the services sector in our banking system, which is kind of like the Swiss banking system, where you can kind of invest money and not declare, anonymously or whatever. So that's kind of one of the things that operates and part of the services sector. And the other thing is we rely in large part on, there's tourism also, but we rely in large part on remittances. So you have people in Lebanon who, even when I was growing up there, it was kind of the same thing. There's not much work in Lebanon, so a lot of families, you go to the United Arab Emirates, you go to Saudi Arabia, you go to Kuwait, you go to North America, Europe, and then you send money back to your family. Excuse me. So that is how a large part of the economy is. It's supposedly 20% of like the income that comes into Lebanon, the total GDP or something, about 20%. That has been going down. I think now it's about 14%. Why? I think in large part because investments in Lebanon are not a very good investment anymore, and people are sick and tired of the corruption. Because you have to pay so much. You have to, oil so many palms just to do what you want to do. So when the remittances are not coming in, so you have people who are sending money in to their families so their families can continue to maybe pay their rent or pay their mortgage or whatever. But are you really investing there? Are you really buying things? No. So who's Lebanon's biggest trading partner? Historically, it's Syria. Syria's economy has shrunk by at least 50%, and it's probably worse than that. So we don't have our trading partner anymore, right? So that's a big problem for our economy. The remittances are down. You have the fact that Iran, because of the sanctions which the U.S. has put on them, which are the strongest sanctions they've ever had against them, and they've had sanctions since at least 1979, their economy is not in good shape. So they cannot pump money into the country anymore. They cannot pump money into Hezbollah either as much as they used to. You have Iraq. Iraq is unstable. So everybody around Lebanon, if you took a map and looked at Lebanon, everybody around it has problems. And that's all impacting Lebanon. Syria is now, there's a new round of sanctions called the Caesar sanctions that the U.S. has put on them. So that's going to make things even more difficult for Syria. So in a lot of ways, a lot of things are going very wrong. And the saddest part about it is these things are not going to get resolved anytime soon. And don't forget the problem with ISIS. The ISIS was occupying certain parts of Lebanon at one point. They had taken some Lebanese soldiers hostage and held them and executed some of them. So Lebanon has anything going on in the region, Lebanon will be dragged into as a small, weaker nation.
I find that when things get really serious and when it gets really political, it's easy to forget what's at the core of the human values, which are compassion and empathy and the desire for peace and understanding. And it is important to be political and to understand the dynamics of the geopolitical aspects of things. And I'm glad you're here to explain these things to me, because I'm kind of an amateur in that sense, but I do understand a few of the concepts. And I do find it sad when people's spirituality and their religious beliefs is being politicized and used against them. I don't know if I find that the concept of the confessionalism is interesting, because it does offer that idea of people coming together and sharing and sharing power with the various different religious beliefs so that there's no strife. Yeah. I guess it's just been hijacked by capitalistic ideas, I think, from my understanding, from what I see. I don't know if that's the right assessment to make.
Well, it's neoliberalism, and the IMF is obviously going around the world kind of forcing upon different countries in exchange for money to make certain reforms which are ultimately in line with kind of neoliberalist policy, which is like, hyper-capitalist. But right now, in the case of Lebanon, it's so bad that there are no other options. So it's going to have to give up. It's going to have to go in line with the demands of the IMF if it wants any kind of economic relief.
Because is it possible for like a grassroots movement that would take over the political aspects or the decision making at some point, like without like a intellectual revolution, but without getting into adding more violence? Is that possible?
Well, let's look at recent history.
Done that, yeah.
Let's look at recent history in the Middle East. So in 2011, we had the Arab Spring. Now, when the Arab Spring, when it first began in Tunisia and started to spread, and one country after another was you're seeing protests, and everybody was kind of taking their turn. I was very hopeful because we were seeing something that we were talking about for many years. We'd always talked about how South America had democratized, and when was the Arab world, when was the Middle East and North Africa going to start the democratization process? Yeah. Technically, we all have parliaments and stuff, but we can't really say that when a strong man like Saddam Hussein or Al-Assad are ruling, that they are democracies. They are at all, by no stretch of the imagination, democracies. So during the Arab Spring, it was very hopeful that these grassroots, because Lebanon and the Arab world has very young population base. I think in Lebanon, it's something like the people aged 15 to 52 are like 60% of the population. So when you have people who are very young, they're more likely to go out in the streets and protest in these types of situations. So, and that's what happened in the Arab Spring. You had young populations who were saying, when are we going to get a piece of our pie? We need change, And look at what happened. The ruling elites, they're not going to give up power. These dictators are going to fight to the death. And this is literally what the Assad regime was saying in the early stages of the revolt. They were saying, we'll fight to the death. Yeah. And they sure have. And Lebanon's a bit different because Lebanon does have some more freedom for journalists, more, freedom of expression for artists. But even that, under the pressure that I was talking about before, the pressure right now, the economic pressure and the pressure on the politicians, we are seeing more of a breakdown of that. So there was one well-known activist in recent days who had, who was assaulted. So somebody came up on a motorcycle and bashed him in the head. These kinds of things are very, very worrying because we don't typically see that in Lebanon. And there's a signal from the state that we're not going to tolerate anybody who is kind of resisting or questioning our authority. So is there an intellectual revolution which can bring Lebanon into more democratic and get rid of these elites? I'm not very hopeful that this is possible.
It's a dangerous
unfortunately,
game.
I see violence. I see what I said before, which is that the ruling elites will start pulling out the specter of civil war. As in, if you continue to question us, this is what you have to look forward to. You have to look forward to a total civil war. And nobody wants civil war. But if they can use it as a weapon to stay in power, they may. They're already playing the blame game with each other. Oh, well, it's you who's doing it. Oh, well, no, it's him. But when you start doing that in a society like Lebanon, where when you're saying him, he's a particular religion. When you're saying him, he's another religion. That can be dangerous. Yeah. But if you manipulate that in order to force the status quo, the public will ultimately have the decision to make. Either they're going to say, okay, well, we don't want war, so we're just going to go in line. Or, well, we want what we want, it's the right thing to do, and so you have conflict. And we're approaching that point soon.
So at some point, people need to take action, and perhaps, I guess, like there is that hope of the grassroots ideas flourishing, intellectual, enlightening people. Is it possible communication-wise, like communicating in books and with the internet now as a tool to convey the information and participate and share and is that possible? Do you believe that this new tool will I mean, it has shown its ability to inspire people and to communicate information. I mean, the Arab Springs was inspiring for right. Here as well. In Quebec in 2012, the student protesting was very inspiring. We went on the streets, and I was there. I was on the streets hitting the pots and pans, that was very inspiring, and it was inspired by the Arab Spring. So I mean, there is now this awareness of everybody's plight, and everybody fighting that peaceful protest is very enlightening for me and inspiring. maybe it's a little bit naive on my part to hope that it will.
Too romantic, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm like you, and I always have been this way. I do believe that I always support these types of groups that are rising up, and I used to go to a lot of protests and stuff. For me personally, at some point, a few years ago, I just kind of said, you know what, there's really no hope. I mean, it's a negative thing to say, but I just felt like broken after a while. After I saw how the Arab Spring ended, after I saw what happened in the U.S. where they kind of keep electing the wrong people because. Not to get too much into U.S. elections, but I think that when you have somebody like Bernie Sanders or somebody like Ralph Nader before him, people who are like, as far as I'm concerned, American heroes. I mean, people who have integrity, people who want to do what's best for the country, and you still go and elect people who are very obviously corrupt.
Yes.
You continue to stick with the status quo because you're afraid of change.
And that's the scary part, because before Trump. Trump is terrible as he is. Before Trump, it was the military-industrial complex that was in charge of the United States, and at a certain degree, I'm looking at the news, and I do feel that there is a tension between that old organization of power that wants Trump to move out of the way because he's not investing enough in war. And like before Trump, it was that. So it can't. After Trump, I hope it doesn't go to that. And I would have really liked to seen Bernie Sanders go into the office, but that obviously wasn't going to happen. There's too many corporate capitalistic ideas, needs to be fulfilled, and yeah, it's
a lot of his things that he wanted to bring in, a lot of his ideas, even something as simple as Medicare, the changes he wanted to make because they're trying to take away what Obama did in Medicare. Even the most unrevolutionary, obvious things, they came out and attacked him, and the Republicans will come out against him and make his life hell, just like they did with Obama every time he tried to do a real change. The problem over there is a big mess, but you see the same thing over there. Because you saw the Bushes. You had two Bushes that were presidents, and you had a third Bush that ran for the Republican nomination. You have the first Clinton, then his wife. Now you have the Trumps, and you have, the families just kind of taking over the White House.
It's the same thing in Lebanon, I guess. It's from father to son.
That is starting to happen, that used to happen in these so-called developing nations, economies or whatever, is now happening also in the U.S.
It's a very primate thing to worship the alpha, or worship that symbol of power, that powerful male figure, the patriarchy. It's unsettling. Yeah. I mean, there's again in the U.S. too. It's becoming this kind of thing where the left and the right are so polarized. Yeah. And you just don't see a way out of it. You just don't see how the two sides are going to find a center point where they can kind of come to some kind of a policy moving forward. And now, of course, the biggest concern is what's going to happen come November when you have the elections, whether Trump will accept the elections should he lose, or whether even the Republicans will, play with the numbers, and that could be a real constitutional crisis if he doesn't step down. I feel it's two sides of the same coin. The Democrats and the Republicans are basically the same monster. At this point,
they have a lot of the same policies when it comes to. They're both neo-liberalistic. They're all about the economy.
Yeah, exactly. They're all about the money. I think that I can't remember who said that. It was I saw that on the news recently, or it was a really interesting analysis where when the Democrats, they started really focusing on making money and profit, and they tossed the people aside. That's where the revolution started to happen. In the lab. I think it started with Clinton, perhaps, or maybe a little bit after. I can't remember.
Well, there's been kind of this shift since the 80s, since basically 1979, 1980. That's when these neoliberalistic policies really began to be enacted globally, like in different countries, and including the U.S. under Reagan. And since then, you've kind of seen that a lot of these policies have been followed by both regimes. And there have been all kinds of protest movements. Black Lives Matter has been around for a while. You have other, movements that have been forming as a result of this. You have, in the U.S., you're talking about maybe 60 million people, like a whole third world country living in poverty in the U.S. And the disparity and the concentration of wealth is kind of equivalent to what it was during the the early 20th century when you had the
Great Depression.
The Great Depression, when the Rockefellers had so much wealth concentrated in their hands. And we got out of that in large part because of World War II and stuff.
The Great New Deal.
This is the kind of thing that we need now. These are the types of reforms we need now. We need billions of dollars invested in infrastructure. We need to try to kind of eliminate this great disparity in wealth. The solutions are not impossible.
They're available.
The solutions are available.
Yeah.
The problem is there isn't the will, because in the same way that in Lebanon the guys have fixed a system which works for them and they don't want anybody messing
with their money.
It's the same thing in the U.S.
Bunch of gangsters.
Bunch of gangsters.
It's sad. It's because investing in people, investing in human power and empowering individuals and investing in society is ultimately supremely important. To neglect that is the death of a country. You're just gonna any country is gonna dry out eventually if you have that way of functioning.
You're right, because the thing is, the government is there to serve the people. I mean, that's why they created the government. The people created government to serve the people, not to serve itself, not to be a political, not to be something that it's not supposed to be profitable for the people who are the politicians. In Lebanon, the politicians are all millionaires, like all of them, like multi-millionaires. That's not what it's supposed to be for. It's supposed to be there to protect the people and to serve the people. And it's the same thing with corporations. Corporations are allowed to operate, not for their own profits only. They're allowed to operate for the benefit of the people. They're given certain, they're permitted to do certain things as a benefit for the public. But is that what they really do? Of course not. What they do is they run after to try to maximize the money as much as possible. Look at pharmaceutical industries, the notorious things that have happened where these companies will, boost up the price of really important drugs from like $2 or $20, whatever, to like 2,000% or some outrageous thing. Now, why is that not legislated? Why is that not something where the government steps in and says this is price gouging?
Yeah.
I mean, during the pandemic, you have a lot of people coming out and saying, "Oh, you're charging $5 for a mask. That's price gouging," and they'll go and they'll charge them and they'll fine them. And well, why isn't what these pharmaceutical companies are doing not price gouging? It most certainly is. If you're somebody who has a particular disease or ailment from which you cannot live without this medication, and you raise the price up to $2,000 a pop or a prescription or whatever, that's outrageous. But it shows to what extent the corporate interests have just completely purchased our government. And how do you get out of that?
I don't know. We need more people. Was it Jonas Salk who gave the vaccine for polio in the... What was that, the 50s? He gave away the vaccine.
I don't know what his name is, but
Jonas
yes,
Salk,
he gave it away for free. That's right.
We need people like that.
We need people like that, absolutely.
Yeah. Integrity. Why is it so difficult to keep integrity when you become an old, creepy politician? Why do we need to grab on to power? Why do we need to be afraid of maybe it's too philosophical a question, but it does come to mind.
I think the system itself is so corrupted that it attracts those types of people. I don't.
Years of war brought that, perhaps, or because it's like that in the States as well. I mean, but the States is a war-mongering country. Their profits, their investment, I think it's for $400 billion for war, and all the money that they make with creating weapons, and so they are a war-mongering country.
Absolutely. They spend more on their defense budget than I think the next 20 countries, and that includes China and Russia and other massive countries, with massive militaries. So it's absolutely outrageous. I mean, I always kind of lament the fact that whenever like you have the people like who are, NASA, for example, who comes out and says, well, we have a project, we're going to build this thing and it's going to go to another planet and it's going to do all these wonderful things, or this, like the Hubble, or what's coming up soon, the new telescope, which is going to basically look back in time and see how, could there be anything more interesting?
Exactly.
For a guy like me, that's like super interesting. And I would say, you know what, spend on it. But every time they try to come up with something, they have to face budget shortfalls and budget cuts and pressure and a lack of interest from the public, because the public's like, okay, so you're flying into space. What's in it for me? Like, you know what I mean? So these same companies who are building these weapons, a lot of them are the same ones who are building some of the parts that are used to go into space and to explore space. So there is an opportunity there for them to say, well, look, develop this so that you can instead spend on something. The race to go to the moon, that was a political thing. It wasn't the U.S. Now looking back on it, you'll say, okay, well, look at the U.S. They went to the moon, but a lot of it was very political because we had to beat Russia. So if it wasn't for this political factor, this political driver, it wouldn't have happened. And since then, we haven't even returned to the moon, let alone go and do any of these other things. But could you imagine if just a small percentage of the defense budget, which is basically used to kill and destroy, just a small percentage of it was taken and applied to the space program or to any other thing that would help society?
Just educating everybody. That should be the purpose of humanity, to have money for everybody to be educated, to have access to education. And as the example of the United States, how people, if you want to have an education, you need to indebt yourself your whole life just to go study. And then after that, you don't even know if you can have a job. Yeah. You're not even assured to have a job. It should be education, and books and information should be given to everybody. It should be an objective for the human race to thrive, to heighten the intellectual capacity for everybody. Everybody should be educated. Who knows? There's an amazing scientist, a future scientist might live somewhere in Africa or in a poor country or in a war-torn country. It's such a terrible thought to think that some countries are devastated by war and some genius might be living in there and not be given access to education for him to grow up and contribute to society, like to the human society.
You're absolutely right.
So sad.
And it's these intellectual pursuits that should be like the things that we are prioritizing our resource towards, in large part. You'd think that we'd want more global equity. You'd think that we'd want to, say, go to these African states which are producing these rare trace minerals that are used that go in our laptops and that go into you'd think we'd want to, pay them fairly instead of bringing in our mining corporations in there and enslaving the local public to, children to work in, deplorable conditions. You'd think that this is something that we wouldn't want. There seems to be like the moral compass has just completely disappeared, and we have nothing but the kind of pursuit of greed at any cost.
It's scarcity. It's when there's not enough. Capitalism is based on slavery. It's based on there needs to be a workforce. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen, what's going to be the next step, what is going to be after capitalism. But capitalism is it has its faults. We realize today we're at the end of that monopoly game, I feel.
Yeah.
There needs to be the next evolution in that shape of like human. I don't even know how to explain capitalism.
But I agree with you. I think that we seem to be arriving at a point where it's kind of like reaching this. There
needs to be exchange between you and me. Like you buy something, I give you something in return. It's a legitimate, functional concept. But what's after? What's the next step?
Well, I think what you were talking about before when you referred to the what's the internet? We're seeing a big shift since the internet. Obviously, the economy's changed a lot. A lot of the things that we couldn't that we had to do before now are just done over the internet, So it's completely changed the economy. But has it made things better? I think that one thing that's changed recently that's interesting is because of COVID, we're all having to work from home. And this is something which I view as a positive personally, because it's something that kind of employees have asked for before, but it sounds like you're giving them too much. Like, oh, you want to work from home? You don't know. If you want a job, you better come in. But now what you're seeing is because we're forced to consider this option, a lot of companies are like, okay, well, maybe this is the future. So now a lot of these types of changes are happening. So in some ways, given the proper environment, some kind of changes can happen.
Yeah.
But the larger changes, I think we're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing until the system breaks, like it has in Lebanon. Lebanon has run out of space. They've pushed it so much that the system has collapsed. I think we need to see some of the same things. I remember, seeing this sign that somebody was carrying at a protest that you see as a meme on the internet all the time, which is and this woman is carrying a sign that said, someday the poor are going to run out of food and all that's going to be left is eating rich people, or eating the rich. The only thing left to eat is the rich. And it's kind of like, why do you need 40, 50, 60, 80 billion, $100 billion? Now they're talking about Jeff Bezos. He's got some new idea that he's going to be coming up with soon.
He's got an idea.
Yeah. And supposedly,
thank you, Jeff.
It'll make him the first trillionaire.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, it's just, it's disgusting.
Yeah, what's the end of that? Why do you need so much money? I mean, and the trickle-down economic thing, it doesn't work.
It's a joke. What I call it is tinkle-down economics, as in what I'm tickling down on you is my urine. I'm like, because it's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
You're tinkling
It
down.
doesn't work. It's bullshit. Sorry, pardon my French. It's bullshit. Yeah, give money to the rich. Fix the 2008, the hedge fund thing.
Yeah.
Send money to the banks. They need that because they totally messed with the money and they invested in things that was just not functional and it totally destroyed the economy. But just give them 400 million and let or billion, 4 billion, or I don't remember what it was.
Ridiculous amounts of money, yeah.
And let the people pay the receipt after that because the people are paying for that still.
Yeah.
And that devalues the American dollar, and it just 2008 was a horrible thing. You look at the northern countries like Iceland and those countries, they put the bankers in the garbage, I think.
Yeah.
There was a video about that.
Yeah. I mean, Obama kind of came into power on the power of his oratory. He was such a great speaker that you couldn't help but be kind of inspired by him. And I was very hopeful. And now that I think back at it, how naive I was.
He won a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, which is laughable. It's laughable.
It was a beautiful thing that an African man would be in the Oval Office. That was amazing. I couldn't believe it. I was happy about that. But afterwards, the bailout, gave money to the banks. That's where I think things might have been different.
Well, I think
on a larger scale.
What happened with him is that he had the great oratory. He came and he inspired people, and he made a lot of promises, which a lot of politicians do. They promise you the world. But with him, I don't think he had the political chops because he was only a senator for like a couple of years. He was a junior senator who served, I think, one term. Then all of a sudden, he's running right away for the biggest office of the land. I think you really have to be a politician. Now, Trump has never served public office, of course, but he's a politician and negotiator. Yeah.
But he likes lobbying.
Exactly. He knows how to communicate with people on that level. But Obama did not have the experience. So when the Republicans just kind of like, he was given a huge mandate. He was given a majority government. He had a majority in Congress. So it means he could have basically passed any law that he wanted that first term. He didn't do anything because he kept going to the Republicans because he had this kind of idea in his head that he had to let's do it the right way, He misunderstood what it was to be a president, as though a president is kind of like this guy at the YMCA who was like, okay, well, here, kid, you take the blue racket and you take the red racket. Now, you guys play fair, and it's like, that's not what a president is. Yeah. You're not there to manage and you're there to lead. You're there to bring new policies and inspire people to prove to people why this policy is one that they should support and win in Congress, pass that law. That is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to lead. He didn't do that.
It must be so unbelievably difficult to be a president of a country.
Yeah.
The stress and the different aspects, the different problems that you need to deal with on every day, nonstop. It must be incredible. Plus, especially the United States, but there is a responsibility, and you need humility. You need to be able to. Are you allowed to have humility when you're a president? Or you're just stuck in that chair where you're in the alpha and you need to show power. I think that's one of the problems as well.
I think that Jimmy Carter, I know it's going back here a while, but I think that Jimmy Carter showed humility when he was a president, and he continues to show humility now in what he's achieved since president, which is in large part more than what he achieved as a president in one term. He was a great leader, and he fell victim to.
I think it was his Secretary of State that dealt with Poland or Russia in the wrong way, and it created some problems for Jimmy Carter. I can't remember.
It's a while back. I don't remember that. What I know that what happened to him is that you had the Iran hostage crisis. So what happened is the Iranian, young Iranian men went into the U.S. embassy and took hostages and held them for many days, and that was kind of manipulated by the Reagan administration to kind of ruin his presidency. So I mean, it's possible to have those people, but it seems like this new generation, those are like maybe the older people, but the newer generation of people, they don't have the same belief systems,
Yeah. It's fascinating. The only way that capitalism can survive is by being corrupt and creating scarcity and creating a need and keeping people destabilized, and it's fascinating. Why is it not just simple to say, let's invest in this country, let's put it back on track? And why does there always need to be these people underground, these lobbyists that are always going to vie for power and are always going to grab the money, it's fascinating. Just right now, what's going on with the Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister, I think I barely looked at are you familiar with this? We don't need to talk about it.
The Wee scandal?
The Wee scandal.
Yeah.
Just that. It's like his mother received a large amount of money for speaking. I think the Clintons did the same thing, unless that was just
They did it after. But for him, I was very surprised that he allowed himself he allowed this. It was such a boneheaded move, in my opinion, because obviously there's a conflict of interest that I think his parents, or I think you said his mother, but I think also his wife has spoken, but she said, oh, well, she wasn't paid for it. And he was saying, well, it's the only charity or whatever that can do this job, and it's just not true, and it's a massive contract. Yeah, I think it's a real error in judgment, especially coming after the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal, which was the reason, maybe some would argue, why he lost his majority government and fell into a minority government, where some of those officials were accused of bribing Libyan officials for contracts or something, and he had gone to his Minister Raybould, I think her name was, Wilson Raybould, that she called them veiled threats and sustained pressure. Basically, as SNC-Lavalin has a lot of employees, they didn't want to they wanted it to be swept under the carpet for the sake of those benefits, So coming after that, you'd think he'd be more careful in making these types of decisions. And clearly the government, the Conservatives, the opposition is calling for him to step down. That's how bad the Wee thing has gotten. So it's a very big mistake. It could be a career ender. It could be the kind of thing where the pressure builds up so much that he loses the next election, which is, when is that going to happen? Is that going to be like in a year from now? We're already, we just had one,
Because there's three mandates for the Canadian Prime Minister, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't think there's a limit. I don't think there's a limit. No? But typically, you're not going to win successive governments more than maybe 3.
Okay. And there's also in Quebec, I think of corruption. Inevitably, if you think of Quebec and corruption, you're going to think about the construction, how it's corrupted, how it's totally out of control. The speed at which construction is done in Quebec, and it's totally out of control, that aspect. There's like, I don't want to just point fingers at, let's say, Trump or the States and Canada, but here, or Lebanon, but I mean, it's everywhere. There's always that thing about cutting corners and always trying to save a little bit of money, just bringing money home just to enrich yourself and just gain a little bit more power. It's inevitable with capitalism. They're in the next format and the next infrastructure of like that thing that's going to guide us in our economies. There needs to be an adjustment in that regard so that we can avoid that. So
I think one of the bigger problems is that, again, I think it's neoliberalism, because since neoliberalism, one of the kind of main tenets of liberalism is the idea of deregulation. So the idea is, businesses have to be able to operate so they can, help the economy, and there's too many regulations and they hamper progress, and this is kind of the premise that the neoliberalists will use, that deregulation is a good thing. But in reality, by deregulating, what ends up always happening is you have more corruption, you have people pushing it, violating the rules. So that's what ends up happening. Another thing with neoliberalism, because what they always say is if you deregulate, it's going to be better for the economy. That's what they always promise. But what we've seen is when you do, for example, deregulate certain industries or whatever, prices go up, people lose their job, so they cut a lot of the employees' base. The service that goes down. So it's just not true. But we continue to kind of trumpet this idea of it being kind of, the way to go, the future. And we're talking about it being a globalist environment. So how do you counter that? The problem is just so deeply kind of entrenched globally. That's why we've seen over the past, especially 20 years, just so much wealth being concentrated within the global elites. Every country has its global elites, and they're becoming wealthier and wealthier. And that's very hard to stop.
Because they represent the banks. The banks are the ones that hold the real power, I believe.
I'll give you an example. In Lebanon, the way it works is the kind of scam that the Lebanese banks have been running. I'm not an economist at all. That's not what I studied or anything. But in a very general sense, is they rely on these remittances that were coming into the country that I told you about. They use that to then fund the state in the sense that they will loan that to the state to operate, to offer services to the public, and that's how it's always been running. But now that the remittances have gone down so much that they can't do it anymore. And who is it that is paying? So the bank is loaning out money to the state so that it can operate. Who is it that owns the bank, in a sense? Who owns it? The same people who are the politicians. So on one end, these guys are the ones who are getting the loans, and on the other end, they're the ones who are making profits off of these loans that they're giving to the government. So it's almost not in their interest to improve things. If they keep things really bad, it's almost more profitable for them. So it's just they have a complete stranglehold. And I think that it's really the same in other places. I mean, who owns the national, the what do you call it? The National Reserve.
Federal Reserve in the States, yeah.
Yeah, it's privately owned. And they're just printing money. And I don't want to get into that whole, conspiracy about that. But in a very general sense, it's the same kind of thing,
And every time you print money, you devalue the money itself, because you put money out in the market, and the money, you create inflation. So I'm not an economist, like myself, but have a look on the web. But you need to watch some videos, people out there, to try and understand. That's a difficulty. I mean, and it is a difficulty because people need to learn. They need to go on the web. They need to get some information and pass it on to other people. And that perhaps is a solution, or at least it moves things forward to create solutions. And that's the whole idea of the grassroots movement currently underway in so many countries. I see the positive of change currently underway. I see little bursts of intellectual revolution and people going out there even though there's COVID, and people are tired everywhere across the world. And that's why I find that it's interesting, the Lebanese story, because it's representative of so many other places on the planet. Everybody, to varying degrees, are going through those similar problems where they're facing the big money people, the banks, the elites, and people have had enough everywhere across the world. And hopefully we're able to... because the elites are using the media. They're using the media for the past years. They've been using media to create dissension. They send out messages out there, and you get angry at other people, and they create dissension amongst the middle class or the crowds. And I think that the communication revolution currently underway with the internet is opening eyes, and people are realizing that we're all facing the same quote-unquote enemy. We're all facing the corruption of banks and capitalistic elites. It's so...
You're right. Because one of the things about this important point that you just made is that historically the way things work is that one of the problems that politicians have is if they go to people and tell them, well, we have to do this thing because A, B, and C, the public is going to be like, why do you... They're not gonna understand the complexity of certain decisions. It's just the way it is. So what they do is they kind of sell things in a more simplified way, because people are not politicians. They're also not historians. They're not they have their job. They work the job. They come home at night. They do their business. They're not going to sit there and research for 3 hours every day trying to understand what the reason is that the government is doing a particular policy and whether it is the right policy. Nobody has that time. So the challenge for politicians is, how are we going to get a certain idea across? How are we going to get what we want? And the answer never is by saying that's what you want. So politicians end up having to kind of play games and manipulate because almost as a necessity in a sense. Now, what you're saying is, let's talk, for example, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that's one of the things that has been going on for a very long time. A lot of people who don't know too much about it will say, well, those people have been killing each other for thousands of years and they'll never find a solution. And it's just so complicated. And
that's what the media says.
It is not complicated at all. It is a very, very simple thing, really. It is a tragic thing, but the resolution to it is not very complex. It's just that there's a great inequity of power, where you have one side which is militaristically very strong and has the full support of the most powerful nation in the world, and the other side who doesn't have a military, who doesn't have any political power, who doesn't have any way to come to the negotiating table and say, well, I have this, so you better give me... It's not a fair negotiation.
And they're going through apartheid, and they're just being repressed, and
that's exactly
violence
right.
is being imposed on them.
And it has gotten to a point where the violence doesn't work. The peaceful negotiations that have been promised, the Oslo Accords and all that doesn't work. Everything results in the same thing, which is their land keeps shrinking, their people keep dying, and their occupiers' land keeps growing, and their people keep prospering. And there's no way out of it for them. But the average person in Canada, do they know the story of Palestine, Israel? Hell no. Who the hell has time to sit around at home and Google it all day and night until you understand it? And for what benefit? It doesn't directly impact me, except that it does. It does impact you because the decisions that the U.S. makes globally in support or against this conflict, and the decisions that the Trudeau government makes globally in support or against this, they impact our lives also. And now what you were saying is that this has changed. Yes, it has changed because of the internet, because now we have the capacity to find any piece of information that we want on the internet to become more informed about it. But are we really doing that? Are we really becoming more informed? To some degree, yes. To some degree, yes. And you got to understand a big reason why people are going to the internet to get their information from alternative news sources is because in large part, again, it is deregulation. So what has happened since the 80s and 90s, and with every successive kind of decade, more and more the media are allowed to operate free of a lot of the original restraints that they had, especially in the U.S. and Canada. So these media companies, first of all, have conglomerated in larger and larger degrees. So you have less and less media companies that are operating and competing against each other, as opposed to having a real kind of environment of competition where you can have many You have the few, just like you have Microsoft and Apple, and that's it. Same thing in that, right? So these are monopolistic practices, and that is what deregulation via neoliberalistic policies really does. It's monopolistic. So when the news agencies, there were a couple of very important laws that I think Reagan and then Clinton removed, which had restraints and restrictions, which forced the media operations, the news agencies, which forced them to operate with some degree of fact. They couldn't just come on like Fox News does, where it's just all nonsense.
Propaganda.
It's all propaganda and nonsense coming from Rupert Murdoch, and then the people believe it.
Yep.
Look at how uninformed typical many right-wing Republican people are in the U.S. They think that COVID is a democratic conspiracy to force Trump out of office and to win the Congress. So that is what the deregulation has done. And what the internet has done is it's opened this portal for people to share information that cannot be stopped and to share facts and to go to alternative news sources, right? And for people to become citizen journalists. So any person can now come out and say, I'm going to report on the news. I'm going to do my own op-eds. I'm going to give my own, reliable news source. And people are going to come and they're going to share this information. So at the same time, because it's kind of unregulated, because how much do you want to regulate the internet? So you have a lot of kind of people out there who obviously are also spreading false information and also then dumbing things down as a result. So it's like any great invention in history. It can be a benefit or it can be a problem.
Yeah, we do have a responsibility as citizens to go inform ourselves. And I think the word you said, the journalistic citizen, it is a responsibility. I'm up for the challenge to take up that title, to be responsible with my information. And often I see things go by on Facebook and I do know that that's not true. So I'm going to go get the article that proves it and then I'm going to post it to show that it's not true. And I do have a responsibility, and I know that we don't have time. We're busy working and we have a contract with business and the capitalism to function as citizens and work and create and buy and make that economy move forward. But I think that at this point, with like you mentioned, the dumbing down of the population through false news and propaganda and Fox News as an example is just a dumbing down of people and not giving access to education to the people is just totally irresponsible for capitalistic, for the elites. I mean, at some point you need to invest in the people. People need to grow intellectually. We need to bring it to another level. And in a certain sense, it's kind of a, it made when you were talking, it made me think of the Black Lives Matter movement. There was a young woman, I forget her name, and I'm sorry, I don't have the specific name, but please go try to find that video. And an outburst of emotion at the crux of the Black Lives Matter thing. She says, you broke the contract. You failed to give us access to education and good lives. Like the police are just like hurting us and killing us. And the ruling elite they broke the contract. And I think that there is a similarity for what's going on globally with the elites just maintaining the corporate capitalistic agenda and just dumbing down the crowds and keeping war as a motive for making money. They broke the contract.
Right. So the social contract, right.
Yeah.
So what it is that, it's kind of like somebody used the term weapons of mass distraction. And that's what it is. It's kind of like the Brave New World scenario as opposed to the 1984 scenario. The Brave New World scenario being that everybody is always artificially happy and distracted too much to pay attention to what is going on.
There's so much entertainment right now. It's crazy. Do you realize like Netflix, Crave, how many are there? And you see usually when a society is overdosed with entertainment, that means there's something wrong going on.
That is on our way to decline, exactly. Yeah. And we're kind of like, technology is going to play a huge role because, as much as there are benefits, how is it going to be? What is the internet going to be 20, 30, 40 years from now, right?
It scares me. Imagine if the capitalists take over the internet. We're going to go to the dark web to transfer information, and it's like the internet. I think it was Trump when Trump went into office. I think they wanted to take over the internet. There was like a vote for. It was 5 people that were supposed to vote about.
Yeah,
do you remember that?
Yeah, there was a law which didn't ultimately pass. They're going to continue to try that.
Okay.
But what internet has really allowed everybody to do is that we have this kind of amateurization thing where before it used to be that you're kind of you do your lot, you have your lot in life, and you have this profession that you do, and you do it. And now the internet has allowed everybody to be anybody can be an actor. You can kind of do amateur acting, and the internet can spread it. You can have alternatives to the monetary system in a sense that you have things like the Bitcoin. You can go on the internet and learn how to be a plumber, or you can learn how to be a musician, or you can learn how to be anything. You can have reality TV. They're not actors, but they're amateur actors. So everything has become kind of possible through the internet. But like any great thing, it's how you use it.
Yeah.
And of course, people have been using it to manipulate us like anything else. How do we get out of it? I mean, in the future, the technology can become so oppressive as the internet starts to become something that we are kind of going into, as opposed to something that is outside of us with laptops, when it becomes kind of more virtual reality, kind of in
like an implant that will allow you to receive your emails, and you're just, okay, hold on, I need to answer my email.
Exactly,
okay,
and that's
I'm
kind
done.
of what the great science writers are envisioning, the internet being something where it's external to us, where we're kind of inside of it. So the internet is something you can just click with your finger like that. So, I mean, technology is very, very interesting, and how is it going to end up being in the next 20, 30 years as far as like our freedoms are concerned? I don't know. I mean, I think that one of the things is that I like to wonder about is, well, right now we've had all these years, we've had money, everything of any value you can acquire with money. Is it always going to be that way? Are we always going to use an exchange, for services and goods that is going to be money? Or in the future, are we maybe going to have more of a kind of a gamified version of how that works?
Pay to play?
Kind of, where our own maybe attributes, our own personal attributes can be exchanged for other things. I mean, there are scientists talking about things that will be replacing money in the future, speculating about things like that. So we don't know how things can change in the next 20, 30 years. I like to think that things are going to get better because I'm ultimately an optimist somewhere on the inside. I'm actually,
that's important.
I believe in humanity. I think that we will overcome and we will continue to exist for a very long time, and that our prospects are limitless. But I can't help but be kind of just heartbroken when I see just how much waste of time there is going on with nonsense.
Yeah.
Like we see with the U.S., who's supposed to be a global leader. And what are they leading us with right now? Just bullshit and stupidity, So it's very kind of... and what does it make you do? One of the things we talked about before is this kind of movement where people are trying to get more in touch with nature. And they're kind of like, there's been this thing happening for the past, 20 years where people are like, okay, forget this, rat race. I'm going to go out in the country. I'm going to buy myself a little house or build an earthship. And I'm just going to like cut myself off from the rest of society because I can't take it anymore. And I'm going to get in touch with nature. I want to be around trees. I want to be around, peace. And I want to work with my hands. And that's kind of a reaction to how things have gotten. There is this effort by people to want to return back to nature. Rejection.
Decentralizing, and that's what you were mentioning before of the idea of these new entrepreneurial ideas of like working from home. It's decentralizing. I think capitalism, as I mentioned before, capitalism functions on scarcity, and eventually there will be enough resources for everybody. There is a way to have enough resources for everybody, but that's scary that's worrying for the elites, because if we have access to enough energy, then there's no need to make money. So
that's a very good point, because the reality is, don't we already have kind of enough if it was more evenly distributed? And I'm not talking about communism. I'm not talking about like taking everything and evenly breaking it out so everybody has the same thing. But I'm just saying, when you have these very high concentrations of wealth, right? Haven't we already gotten to a point to some degree where we could technically use the collective resources to eliminate a lot of the rampant, extreme poverties of the world? But again, that's a structure of power that is existing. That how do we break it? And the people themselves are not gonna, they're not gonna reform themselves out of money. So how do you fix it? Well, violence. Okay, but violence destroys everything, just like we saw in the Arab world during the Arab Spring. So what is the solution? I don't know what the solution is, but I think we're getting to the point where it's getting so polarized, and poverty has gotten so extreme that something's got to give.
Yeah. Well, I think it's people's own investment in politics and in their society. I think we've been given the impression that we didn't need to invest that to be a journalistic citizen, or to invest time in talking and discussing matters in a polite and diplomatic way. People have been told, no, you can stay at home, watch TV, don't worry about it. The government's there, the society's there, we have people investing in our society, the economy's good, everything's going to be all right. But at some point, everybody has a responsibility to talk and to be open-minded to other ideas, and to share information, and to share ideas about new technologies. And I think perhaps there are solutions in that regards, in that idea. And I don't know what you think about like Lebanon having creating their own value, and having more focus on local-based economy, and creating produce, and creating crafts, and exporting goods for a change. I don't know what you think about that.
We just don't produce it. The system is so ineffective. The system is so dysfunctional. These things are good solutions. One of the things that's been happening in recent months since the economic crisis there is that people have been trying to come up with ideas where, in one fell swoop, we're going to fix everything. But the problem is many, many layers of varieties of problems centered around the things we already discussed with the corruption of the elites who are hanging on to power. We don't produce enough stuff to export anything. We don't have anything to export. We have tourism, Lebanon is beautiful. It's right on the Mediterranean, so there's a lot of kind of picturesque scenes and a lot of beautiful weather, and people are very hospitable, and you can go to the mountains. So tourism is very important for Lebanon, but of course that was non-existent during the Civil War for a long time, so Lebanon hasn't fully recovered from that. But one of the solutions that supposedly they were coming up with is this Leviathan natural gas field that they found. Because Lebanon is not a natural resource producing country. We don't have anything like that. But when they discovered it, and supposedly, Israel has part of it and the Palestinian territories have part of it, they were saying that there trillions of cubic feet or meters, and some oil even in the Lebanese portion. And there was I think 10 or 12 different areas of it which needed to be explored. And I think very recently, so the politicians were promoting that as kind of the saving grace, where now we're going to become an oil producing and natural gas producing companies. Voila, problem solved. Well, they just went and did like a thing where they looked and they checked, and they didn't find anything in one of them. They found nothing. So that idea is gone. And there was another one which people have been throwing around. I read an article. Why maybe Lebanon should start should decriminalize marijuana and start, because we have, in the Bekaa Valley or whatever, we have hash there that grows. That was another one of these kind of solutions that we're trying to find to kind of just fix the whole problem all at once.
There are it's a grouping of a vast array of solutions. I mean, people need to put their heads together. People need to put their heads together and generate ideas that will build an economy. And I have no problem with buying Lebanese hash, honestly. If that was on the market, if I would be able to purchase a guitar from Lebanon, I would love to own that. If I was able to get some Lebanese wine. I mean, it's all these different efforts of entrepreneurial ideas that might actually have an impact. I mean, oil is not a solution, I don't think, right? Everybody, I mean, I'm generalizing by saying everybody wants to get rid of oil, but there is a problem with plastic and the pollution of oil and all that. So perhaps developing green ideas. I know the prior podcast I did with Reina Halab, she explained that the loofah farm in Montreal, I think it is, and the person behind it is a Lebanese man. And so I don't know to what extent
I didn't know that.
Yeah, loofah farm, have a look. So there are little tiny ideas like that can generate money, that can create economies. And I think the solution is local. Even in Quebec, we're always fighting. Like when I go to the grocery store, I don't buy American products. I don't want to invest in American products. I'm going to buy local if I can.
Yeah.
So...
No, I agree with you, and I think that does exist. The Lebanese people are known for their entrepreneurial abilities, but the problem is they leave Lebanon, and they're always going and using their skills elsewhere because of the system in Lebanon. So I think that I totally agree with you. I mean, there is a lot of creativity in Lebanon. A lot of people, local economies and organic produce and whatever, you name it, and there's much more room for that to develop. But the problem is the cancer of Lebanon is the current political system and the ruling elites. And that hampers everything. Because Lebanese people do not want to leave Lebanon. They don't want to leave their home. Nobody wants to leave their home. They're leaving because they're desperate, because there are no opportunities. And it's been like that for many decades. But if the system were to stabilize, if we were to have the kind of democratic system that we thought we had or that we want to have, a stable economy with limited corruption, a true democracy, I think many people would come back and the economy would flourish and we would have all kinds of projects and things would get a lot better. But, this is the kind of wasting disease that is corruption in Lebanon, where it's just bleeding out talent and bleeding out so much money that you can't recover from it on that. The solution has to begin with addressing the elephant in the room, which is the endemic corruption. And then that'll allow for everything else to happen.
Do you see it as it's going to change? And what's your forecast?
As it keeps getting worse, unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, the fact that politicians are starting to throw accusations around, and just how bad it is getting. I think I read the other day somewhere that there was a man who walked into a pharmacy with a pistol and held up the pharmacy, and he asked for diapers. And this is kind of the real sad desperation that is starting to happen in Lebanon, So something's got to give. I mean, what has to happen is Lebanon has to just accept the IMF offer to have for the reforms. I think they have 4 conditions that they're asking for the IMF. One is for them to return to the table. One is for them to allow the auditing of the banks. The other one is some kind of capital controls, which is what's happening supposedly is they're not allowing people to withdraw money because there's a shortage of money. There's a shortage of U.S. money. So they're setting limits on the individual, person. They can withdraw, I think, $100 a day or something. And they've also passed, they've also stated that there are no more monies that are allowed to be taken, transported overseas. So they don't want this big flight of money when there's no money. That would be catastrophic. Yet, apparently, there has been as much as $6 billion that the elites themselves, the bank, has facilitated to sneak out of the country. So people are losing their money because the value of their money is going down and the money is disappearing, and these guys are sneaking their money out of the country themselves. Honestly, I don't see a way out of it other than they accept these conditions. And the 4th condition that the IMF has set, I believe, is reform of the electrical system, the electrical grid. Because in Lebanon right now, for as long as I've been alive, Lebanon has never had regular electricity. I mean, during the Civil War, there was no electricity. Everybody has generators. So you got to pay for the regular electricity, and you got to buy a generator and pay for that, which it kicks in when the electricity is gone. Now, because of all the shortages, because they can't pay, the government can't pay, there is something like 2 or 3 hours a day of electricity in Beirut. So how are you going to operate your business? How are you going to, if you can't afford a generator, the traffic lights have stopped working. So it's just chaos. It's total chaos. So the only way really out of it is for the IMF to kind of force Lebanon to care more about its people than itself, right? And agree to these reforms and actually enact these reforms. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen when the Lebanese people see that these guys have been, funneling tens of millions of dollars into their own pockets? So it's very, very bad. I don't know how it's going to come out.
Yeah, it's difficult to press charges against presidents and political the government. I mean, Trump he's as an example, he's totally immune to any kind of you can't charge him. He's got so much money. He's got all the lawyers in his pockets.
They already tried to do it, and the Republicans would not play ball. They're going to support him no matter what, no matter how bad he is. There was already, I think, through WikiLeaks a few years ago, I can't remember which one it was, I think it was the Panama Papers, which showed some of the corruption going on among Lebanese politicians right there. And it was all public, and nothing's going to change. I mean, it's just going to continue. So unfortunately, the type of possibilities now, people are going to continue to come out in the streets in larger numbers. There is the possibility, of course, you have to take consideration Hezbollah, because Hezbollah supports the current government, and they're under a lot of pressure. And they're also a political party, so they have their own political representation, and they support the current state of being. But they're the only armed militia in the country. They're armed, and they're more powerful than the Lebanese army for sure. And so when are we looking at some kind of a civil strife upcoming? I wouldn't be surprised if something like that didn't happen.
Is there any other things that you might like to talk about that we haven't addressed? We've been talking for almost 2 hours.
I've talked your head off. Yeah.
No, this is really interesting. Thanks so very much for dropping by. I was looking forward for a conversation. I really appreciated you. Really enlightened me. I love politics and history and all that stuff. So this was really interesting for me. So are there any websites or places that you might want to send people for information or things in that sense?
Well, I just I don't know particular websites. I would just keep myself apprised of all the goings on. Just stay informed by going to basically a variety of websites. If you go into your own, if you say I'm a liberal, so I'm going to go to this liberal website, you're creating this kind of feedback machine where you're just hearing what you want. Especially if you're go on Facebook and subscribe to tons of things. One of the reasons why I stopped being on Facebook is because you're just subscribing to these different pages, which are all kind of just reaffirming what you already believe. So it's not much growth there. You're just kind of believing what you believe, and you're kind of putting these blinders on to some degree. So you want to go on and look at what the other guys are thinking, what the guys you don't agree with are thinking. Are there any nuggets of truth in what they're saying? Is there a perspective that is different than yours that might give you something to learn, that could be useful for you? That's what I would say to people. I would say people to pay attention to what's going on in the Middle East and North Africa, because a lot of that instability impacts the rest of the world. That's where most of the world's oil is, and the prices of the oil, we see how it impacts at the gas pump. So I would say to people, just keep yourself informed as much as possible from a variety of sources.
Yeah, I'm really happy you were here today, Tarek Chatila. Thank you so very much. And if this podcast that we just did can send some information, positive vibes out there, and people keep being hopeful, and I'm glad that I could give you this time to talk. And we should do this again. Actually, we're a little bit contained, we don't have that much time, but definitely if you want to come back again some other time in the near future, I would love to talk with you again. Thank you so very much.
It's been my pleasure, and it's been very, very helpful for me to talk to you too. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.